Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure, as always, to follow the honourable gentleman. I believe the Prime Minister and the Government deserve the time and the space to meet the assurances that they gave this House on the 29th of January to deliver a legally binding change to the backstop and to press the Malthouse Compromise as an alternative in Brussels. I want the Prime Minister to be able to deliver Brexit. I want the Government to be able to deliver and make a success of Brexit. And I also want, Mr. Speaker, it to be crystal clear that the only way we will leave on WTO terms is by the choice of the EU through the intransigence of its approach. Now, Mr. Speaker, turning first to the amendments today, it is telling that all of the amendments are process amendments. None stipulate a specific alternative strategic objective of their supporters. So none actually say anything at all about the substance, notwithstanding their criticism of the government. And as a result, none offer a credible alternative to the path set out by the Prime Minister, which is, of course, written in both to UK law but also reflective of international law under the Lisbon Treaty, namely that we will leave the EU on the 29th of March, either with a deal, as is being negotiated, and which I believe is still possible, or on WTO terms. And I think, Mr. Speaker, we do need to make sure we leave the European Union on the 29th of March. We need it for the certainty and clarity that businesses require. We need it for the finality that the public wants. An end to the tortuous haggle with Brussels, an end to the distraction and the displacement of all the other activity in this place and in the government at large, which has inevitably followed Brexit. And it seems to me, Mr. Speaker, that extending Article 50 cannot make any of the problems or any of the challenges that we've got easier. They can only make them worse. It is also clear, I'll just make a little bit of progress, that the EU will not agree unless there is a clear alternative model on the table which is reasonably deliverable within a finite period of time. Of course, some of the other suggestions that have been made, whether it requires legislation, whether it requires the Norway model or some other whizzy idea that no doubt is being conjured up by thoughtful minds across on the other side of the House and indeed on this, would all require time both to legislate but also to negotiate, and we don't have that time and the EU wouldn't accept it. I give way to the Honourable Member.
Thank you for giving way. It says it expects a deal can still be negotiated. Now, given one of the reasons for the backstop is the admission that at the moment there's no off-the-shelf technology solution that can provide a working mechanism to have no border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. So if there's no off-the-shelf solution just now, how is a solution going to be found in the next 40-odd days that would allow the backstop to be removed? It's impossible, is it not?
Well, no, I think, with respect to the Honourable Gentleman, he raises a perfectly respectable point. But I think if he listens to what the head of HMRC has said, that we wouldn't need to see any extra infrastructure at the border under any circumstances. And on his point on time, of course, whilst I don't accept the point he made about the absence of technological solutions, we will have the implementation period to work closely with our partners in Dublin and the EU to make sure that that can be put in place. Now, Mr. Speaker, of all of the question-begging amendments, the one in the name of the Right Honourable Member for Islington North is the most devoid of credibility for three reasons. On the one hand, the leader of the Labour Party wants to be a member of a customs union, the customs union, but at the same time he boasts of his plans to nationalise half the country, which would immediately and directly conflict with those rules. On the other hand, he personally is widely regarded, although he doesn't say it quite so explicitly, as being a proponent of Brexit. He wants to leave the EU, along with many on his side and on his benches, and of course it is a requirement of the 2017 Labour Party manifesto. But on the other hand, he's willing to trade free movement to allow open access to our borders in order to get a deal. Again, despite the pledges to exit the single market made in the Labour Party manifesto. And finally, whilst he has pledged in his manifesto to leave the EU and the single market at the 2017 election, he is flirting with a second referendum, and yet without any indication of what the question might be, or indeed which side he would be on. I think that his members in this House, the members and supporters in the various Labour Party associations, and indeed the public at large, are entitled to question and come up to the conclusion that it is nothing but a fraud, a con. It is not a serious position. And I think that is something which was affirmed by the shadow Brexit Secretary, the Honourable Member for Holborn, He talked of the hundreds of businesses he has met who have raised as the #1 issue uncertainty. And I can imagine that because we've all heard businesses talk about uncertainty, and the public wants some finality too. But if he was genuinely serious, if his party was serious, that is precisely why the Labour Party would rule out extending Article 50 and indeed would rule out holding a second referendum. But the Shadow Brexit Secretary did neither. He said he was sympathetic to the extension of Article 50, so he and the Labour Party are fueling precisely the uncertainty that they then criticise. And I'm afraid it's the usual fork-tongue, flip-flopping nonsense from the Labour Party, impossible to square with the clear promises they made in their manifesto. Now, Mr. Speaker, I won't, because I've undertaken to proceed swiftly to the end in order that other members can get in. But I just want to say in relation to the government motion, I will support the government on all of the amendments this evening, but I have some concerns about the motion because it adopts as government policy the amendment tabled and passed on the 29th of January by my right honourable friend, the member for West Midlands, which risks implying that we can't leave on WTO terms on the 29th of March. I think that that would be the wrong message as a matter of policy to send to the EU at this crunch moment in the talks, not least given some of the unfortunate remarks reported by ITV from the leader of the civil service delegation in Brussels. I think it also begs the question about how that marries with the position under law in UK legislation, which is our default position, that we would leave on the 29th of March, and which I'd understood was explicitly government policy. And I listened very carefully to the assurances of the Secretary of State, but they then in turn seem to conflict with the motion itself, which is, I'm afraid, the problem that we still need some clarity on. The government motion also makes no mention of the so-called Malthouse Compromise proposal, and indeed we've heard nothing about whether this has been formally tabled with our EU friends and partners. I understand it's been raised and discussed with Michel Barnier, but has a written version of this actually been shared? We're several weeks on from the 29th of January. This was the basis on which the Brady Amendment was adopted, and I think it's a legitimate question to ask. On that basis, I will vote against the amendments, but I am, at the moment at least, struggling with the idea of voting for the principal motion, but I will listen very carefully to the further assurances that ministers will give in winding up, because I would rather be in a position of supporting the government, because I think the government needs the time and the space to go into bat with Brussels to deliver the best deal for this country. We have a reasonable, modest set of demands to get a deal over the line, and we want the government to go in with the strongest hand possible.
Thank you,